It was late September 2019 when I decided to go camping alone in northern Arkansas. I had just turned 29 a few months earlier, and work had been eating me alive ever since. I felt like I needed a real break. No phone, no computer, no people. Just trees, dirt, and cold air. I packed up my old green Nissan Frontier with a tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra food, water, and a .22 rifle I usually took for small game if I got the urge. I also brought a cheap map I had picked up from a gas station the week before, even though my phone still had a bit of signal back then. I picked a place called Bitter Hollow to camp. It was about 2.5 hours from my little apartment in Russellville. Most people didn't talk much about Bitter Hollow. It wasn't a popular spot like Mount Magazine or Petit Jean. It was more of a locals-only kind of place, the kind you heard about through word of mouth. It was a little basin surrounded by thick woods, with an old service road that led maybe a mile down into it before ending at a dried-up creek bed. The morning I left, the air was heavy and damp. The sky was that dull, dead gray that usually promised rain later, but I didn't mind. I liked camping better in colder weather anyway. Fewer bugs, fewer people. I drove out of town, following the old highway, passing half-abandoned gas stations, broken barns, and long stretches of nothing but trees turning red and gold. After about an hour, I turned onto a narrow blacktop road, and then onto a gravel one that cracked and popped under my tires. The last turn was onto a dirt service road so rough that I had to crawl the truck along at a walking speed just to keep from bottoming out. The trees grew thick and tall on both sides like a tunnel. It felt like I was driving into another world. After maybe half an hour, the road opened up into a clearing not much bigger than a football field. A dried-up creek bed cut through the middle of it, lined with smooth gray stones. There was an old fire ring made of blackened rocks near a grove of skinny pines. Other than that, it was just me, the trees, and the wind. I set up camp fast, popping the tent near the fire ring and gathering some fallen wood for a fire later. I wasn't planning to stay too long. Maybe 2 nights, 3 tops, just enough to clear my head. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the air turned sharp and cold. I built a small fire, cooked some hot dogs, and leaned back against a log, staring at the stars slipping through the branches overhead. Everything was still and peaceful the way I wanted. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the wind rubbing the trees together. Around midnight, I put out the fire, crawled into my sleeping bag, and drifted off. The first weird thing happened just before dawn. I woke up to the sound of crunching footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps like someone trying not to make a sound but failing. My heart kicked into gear immediately. I lay frozen, holding my breath. The steps circled the tent once, maybe twice, and then faded off toward the woods. I stayed completely still, listening, until the sun started to lighten the inside of the tent with that dull gray morning light. When I finally unzipped the door and looked out, there was nothing there. No prints in the dirt, no broken branches, nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe even a raccoon. I tried to shake it off, but the pit in my stomach stayed. The second day was quiet. I went on a short hike through the woods, following an old trail that led up one side of the hollow. There wasn't much to see, just trees, rocks, and more trees, but the view from the top was beautiful. You could see for miles, a rolling sea of fall colors stretching out in every direction. The wind up there was colder, sharper, almost whistling through the branches. I sat for a while, just listening to it and letting my mind empty out. Back at camp, I noticed something small but strange. My gear wasn't exactly how I'd left it. The sleeping bag looked a little off, not rolled the same way I remembered. My stove was shifted a few inches to the left. Little things that maybe I could have done without thinking, but it still bothered me. I kept trying to tell myself it was nothing. I was tired. Maybe I moved things and forgot. That night, I made a bigger fire, trying to push the unease away. I sat up later, drinking a few beers I had packed, staring into the flames. When the fire started to die, I doused it and crawled into the tent again. This time, I kept the rifle next to me inside the bag. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke again. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was the sound of breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing right outside the tent. It was so close that for a second, I thought someone was inside the tent with me. My mouth went dry. I stayed absolutely still, listening. The breathing lasted maybe 20 seconds, maybe less, but it felt like forever. Then it stopped. Silence. I gripped the rifle tighter, my fingers slick with sweat. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, heart hammering, until the sky finally turned pale and the birds started up. When I finally dared to unzip the tent and step out, everything looked the same. No prints, no signs. The clearing was empty, but something had changed in me. I felt it deep, like an animal feeling the wrongness in the air before a storm. I packed up fast. I knew I should leave. When I tossed the last of my gear into the truck bed, I noticed something else. Deep in the woods, maybe 50 yards out, there was something hanging from a tree. At first, I thought it was just trash, like a plastic bag caught on a branch. But when I squinted, I saw it was a bundle of sticks, tied together with what looked like strips of cloth. It was hanging by a rope, swinging slightly in the wind. My stomach turned. I didn't go check it out. I climbed into the truck and started the engine, heart pounding. I told myself it was probably just some kid's prank. Probably hunters messing around. Probably, but I didn't believe it. The drive back up the service road felt 10 times longer than the drive down. Every pothole, every bump, felt like it was slowing me down. Halfway up, around a sharp curve where the trees pressed tight to the road, I saw something that made me slam the brakes so hard the truck slid in the dirt. There was a man standing in the middle of the road. He wasn't wearing any kind of hunting gear. No orange, no camo. He looked dirty, with torn jeans and a dark green jacket. His hair was long and greasy, hanging in his face. He didn't move when I stopped. He just stood there, staring at me, head tilted slightly like he was studying me. My mouth went dry again. I sat there, frozen, for a long second. Then I hit the gas. I wasn't gonna sit around and see what he wanted. I jerked the wheel and drove off the side of the road to go around him, the truck bouncing over rocks and brush. In the rearview mirror, I saw him still standing there, turning slowly to watch me as I sped away. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove the rest of the dirt road, the gravel road, the blacktop without stopping. I didn't even breathe right until I hit the highway and could see other cars again. Civilization. Safety. Back home. I unpacked the truck immediately, locking every door and window in my apartment. I sat on the couch for hours, just staring at the wall, feeling like my brain was still stuck back in those woods. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time. Not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, I didn't even care about that, but because just talking about it made my skin crawl. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up at night, convinced I hear breathing just outside my window. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone anymore, and never anywhere near Bitter Hollow. I later learned, just by accident, that there were rumors about that place. Rumors about people living rough in those woods. Not homeless people, not exactly. More like people who didn't want to be found. People who didn't want outsiders coming through. Whatever was out there that night, whatever was breathing inches from me, whoever that man on the road was, they were real. Flesh and blood. Not ghosts. Not monsters. And knowing that somehow makes it a whole lot worse. It was the kind of quiet that almost felt too thick, like the air was holding its breath. I had driven out to a small, secluded campsite in the heart of Wyoming, somewhere around 20 miles off the nearest dirt road. The place was supposed to be one of those hidden gems where the only sounds you'd hear would be the rustling of leaves, the call of a bird, maybe the occasional bear rummaging through the forest, but that was all. I'd been craving solitude for weeks, away from the noise of work, the constant stream of notifications, and the endless chatter of city life. It was supposed to be simple, just me, the open woods, and the campfire. I arrived just before dusk, which meant I had just enough time to set up before the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was crisp, but not cold, perfect for camping. I was alone, and I liked it that way. No one to answer to, no plans to follow, just a quiet evening and a night under the stars. The campground was small, tucked away in a grove of trees, their bark dark with age, and their limbs stretched up high like ancient sentinels. There was an old fire ring at the center, its stone edges overgrown with moss and roots creeping through the cracks. A dilapidated sign nearby, half buried in the underbrush, marked the spot as Campsite 6. I was the only one here. Perfect. I unloaded my gear, setting up my tent and spreading out my sleeping bag on the damp ground. There was something calming about the process. Slowly, methodically arranging my things, making sure everything had its place. I took out the small stove and started boiling water for a cup of coffee. I always made sure to keep some semblance of routine when I camped, even if it was just for a day or two. Kept the mind clear. The smell of the forest was heavy with pine and damp earth. I took a deep breath. It had been a while since I'd been this far out, but it felt like home. The air was so fresh here, like it hadn't been touched by human hands in years. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The trees looked almost black in the fading light, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. I had built the fire by now, and the crackle of the wood seemed louder as the world grew darker around me. I sat by the fire, sipping my coffee and watching the flames dance, my mind drifting. That's when I first noticed it. The sound. It was faint at first, just a rustling in the underbrush far off to the side. I thought nothing of it at first, assuming it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the woods. But then it came again, a soft but unmistakable rustling, closer this time. Something was moving out there, and it wasn't just a squirrel or bird. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, squinting into the darkness, trying to make out anything in the shadows. The woods seemed still, but my senses were on high alert. It was hard to describe, just a feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I told myself it was nothing, just a deer, or maybe a bear. Animals roamed these woods all the time, but then the rustling stopped. There was silence. The fire crackled, the only noise now. I didn't sit back down. Something about the stillness made me uneasy. I grabbed a stick from the fire and poked it deeper into the flames, trying to convince myself that it was just the quiet of the forest settling in for the night. Then I heard it again, closer this time, almost like a heavy footstep. I froze. That wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd heard before in these woods. It was too deliberate, too heavy. It wasn't an animal. I stood there, staring into the darkness, trying to listen. My heart was thumping in my chest. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable now. My thoughts raced. Could it be another camper? Maybe someone else who had come out here for solitude too, and now they were just moving about, minding their own business? No, this was different. The air felt wrong, too tense, like a heavy pressure pressing in from every direction. The sound of the footsteps came again, louder this time. It was impossible to mistake. Someone was out there, and they were walking toward me. I took a slow, deep breath and grabbed my flashlight. My hand was shaking, but I tried to stay calm. I had to see who or what was out there. I moved toward the edge of the firelight, cautiously stepping into the shadows, shining the beam of the flashlight out into the dark woods. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating only brief glimpses of the underbrush. Nothing was there, just trees, rocks, and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. No figure, no person, but I still felt it, the sense that something was out there watching me. I took another step forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Then, without warning, the sound came again, closer, the unmistakable crunch of leaves and twigs, just behind the tree-line. My breath caught in my throat. I stood still, my mind racing, trying to think of a reason, any reason that could explain the noises. Was it another camper? Maybe someone lost, looking for the trail? Maybe an animal? But the sound was too heavy, too human. The way it moved was calculated, deliberate. It wasn't the shuffle of a wild animal. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it, the snap of a twig right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight beam swept across the clearing, but there was nothing there, just the darkness of the trees and the ever-present shadows. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. No more footsteps, no more sounds. The forest seemed to exhale, as if nothing had happened. I didn't feel safe anymore. The quiet was no longer comforting. It felt suffocating. I grabbed my backpack, shoved my essentials into it. Water, a few snacks, my phone, and I quickly made my way back to the fire, though I knew it wouldn't offer much protection. The air felt thick with something that wasn't right, like I wasn't alone anymore. As I sat by the fire, trying to calm my nerves, I heard the footsteps again, this time much closer. They were circling like the person, or whatever it was moving around me, keeping just out of sight. The noise was subtle but deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, the only thing that seemed to offer any reassurance. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to make a sound, didn't want to give away my position if someone, if anything, was out there watching me. The tension was unbearable. I sat there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. I'd never been so aware of every sound, every rustle of wind, every snap of a branch. I couldn't take my eyes off the edge of the trees, the darkness that seemed to press in tighter with each passing minute. Then, finally, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. It was as if the forest itself had stopped breathing. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed my things, stuffed the fire into the ground to douse it as quickly as I could, and I made my way toward the trail. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from the camp, from whatever was out there. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The flashlight beam bounced erratically as I stumbled through the underbrush, not even caring if I was making noise. I just had to get away. I walked for what felt like an eternity, the woods becoming less familiar with every step I took. Every shadow, every flicker of light between the trees made my pulse spike. I finally found a narrow path that led me to a clearing where I could see the faint glow of a distant light. A road, maybe, or another campsite. I followed the path, moving as quickly as I could, the distant hum of traffic from the highway growing louder the farther I walked. By the time I reached the road, I was exhausted, drenched in sweat, and my mind was a blur of adrenaline. I didn't look back. I didn't care to know who or what had been out there in the dark, but I was damn sure glad to be away from it. I didn't return to that campground. There was no way I could go back to that place, not after everything that happened. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there, and I'd never make the mistake of thinking I was again. I was 28 years old when I went camping in the northern part of Arizona, not too far from a small town called Show Low. It was early October 2018, and the weather had just started cooling off after a brutal summer. I had been living in Flagstaff for a couple of years and had gotten pretty used to camping on weekends. Usually, I stuck to familiar places, but that weekend, I decided I wanted something more remote. I wanted a place where I wouldn't see a single other person. I packed up my old gray Ford Ranger, grabbed my dog Max, a 7-year-old black lab mix, and left town after work on Friday. I had heard about a spot from a guy at work, a clearing about 2 hours east, way off the main road. He said hardly anyone went there anymore because the forest roads had gotten too rough for regular cars. That sounded perfect to me. I wanted real quiet, real solitude. I had no idea at the time that it would turn into the worst night of my life. I filled the truck with gas, grabbed a couple sandwiches and some Gatorades from the gas station, and made my way east. By the time I got to the forest road, the sun was starting to get low. The first few miles weren't too bad, just dusty and bumpy, but the farther I got, the worse it became. Deep ruts, big rocks, and random branches everywhere. I slowed down to a crawl and kept going. I didn't see another car or truck the whole time. After about an hour on that miserable road, I finally found the clearing. It wasn't huge, just a wide, flat area surrounded by tall pines and some scraggly junipers. The ground was a mix of dry dirt, patches of yellow grass, and fallen pine needles. Perfect. I pulled the truck close to the tree line, just in case it rained, and set up my tent about 20 feet away. Max ran around sniffing everything, tail wagging like crazy. I laid out my sleeping bag inside the tent, set up a little fire pit using some old stones that were already there, and gathered some firewood. I had a little hatchet with me, so I chopped up some smaller branches too. By the time the fire was going, it was dark. Real dark. Out there, without any streetlights or houses around. The night felt heavier somehow. It swallowed up everything outside the little circle of light from the fire. The sky was full of stars, and it was so quiet I could hear the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Max lay next to me by the fire, chewing on a stick. I ate one of my sandwiches, gave Max some dog food, and leaned back against a log, just soaking it all in. That feeling of being totally alone. No cars, no voices, no phones. It was exactly what I had been craving. I didn't even build a huge fire because I didn't want to draw attention. Just enough to keep warm and see a few feet around me. Around 10 p.m., I decided to turn in. I threw some dirt on the fire, made sure it was really out, and climbed into the tent with Max. I left the rain fly off so I could see the stars. It was chilly but not freezing, probably around 45 degrees. I zipped up the sleeping bag, rolled over onto my side, and listened to Max breathing softly next to me. At some point in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first.
No sounds, no weird dreams.
Just that sudden jolt you get sometimes. Like your body knows something's wrong even if your mind hasn't caught up yet. I lay still, listening. Max was awake too, ears perked up, staring at the tent wall. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the dirt and pine needles, just outside the tent. Not an animal. Not the quick scamper of a squirrel or the heavy crash of a deer. These were human steps, careful and slow, like someone was trying not to make any noise. My heart started pounding. I reached for the hatchet, which I had shoved down by the sleeping bag just in case. I gripped it tight, holding my breath. Max let out a low, rumbling growl deep in his chest. Not loud, but enough that I could feel it through the ground. The steps circled the tent. Once, twice. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Whoever it was, they didn't say anything, didn't make any other sounds. Just walking around us. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay quiet, to not move. After a few minutes, or maybe it was just seconds, the steps stopped. I strained my ears but couldn't hear anything else. Max was still tense, staring at the same spot. I didn't dare unzip the tent or make any noise. I just lay there, muscles locked tight, barely breathing. Eventually, I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion. I woke again just as the first gray light of morning started creeping in. Max was still awake, head on his paws, eyes wide open. I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully, and peered outside. Nothing, just the clearing, the trees, the cold morning air. I stepped out, heart still hammering, and looked around. There were footprints in the dirt. Clear human footprints, barefoot. Whoever had been out there had no shoes on. I followed the prints a few feet before they disappeared into the woods. I packed up as fast as I could. Tent, sleeping bag, fire pit. I didn't care how messy it was. I just threw everything into the truck bed, slammed the tailgate shut, and jumped into the driver's seat. I didn't even bother with breakfast. Max leapt in beside me and didn't make a sound. The drive out felt like it took forever. Every bump and jolt made me more paranoid. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone or something chasing after me through the dust. But there was nothing. When I finally hit the paved road, I didn't stop. I drove straight back to Flagstaff, only pulling over once at a gas station to let Max pee and to get some coffee. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. What could I say? That some barefoot weirdo stalked my tent all night? The days that followed were rough. I kept thinking about those footprints, about how careful the steps had been, about how whoever it was didn't make any noise other than walking, about why they were barefoot in the middle of nowhere in the cold. At first, I thought maybe it was a crazy person, someone living out there off the grid. But the more I thought about it, the weirder it seemed. The prints were thin, almost delicate, like they belonged to someone with really small feet. And the way they moved, slow, almost too slow, didn't sit right with me. A few weeks later, I was talking to an old guy at a hardware store. He was Navajo, lived his whole life around the area. I mentioned, without going into much detail, that I had camped out east and had some weird stuff happen. His face got real serious. He told me real casually, like he was talking about the weather, that there were stories about that land. Old stories. About things that weren't exactly human but could look like it if they wanted to. Skinwalkers, he called them. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff. Still don't, really. But something about the way he said it, so calm and sure, stuck with me. In the end, I don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was some hermit living wild. Maybe it was just some messed up prank by another camper I never saw. Or maybe it was something else. Something older and stranger than I could wrap my head around. All I know is I never went back to that part of Arizona again. I stuck to established campgrounds after that, places with other people around. It wasn't about being scared of ghosts or legends. It was about knowing deep down that sometimes the woods hide things that don't want to be found. And that sometimes, if you're not careful, they find you instead. It was 2021, and I was 27 years old when I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in a forest just outside of Eugene, Oregon. I had gotten tired of the daily grind, tired of the screens, the traffic, the noise that never seemed to die down even late at night. My life felt too boxed in, too predictable. I wanted to go somewhere I could breathe again, even if just for a couple of days. I wasn't a total beginner at camping. I had been on a few trips with friends before, but this was going to be my first real solo trip. Just me, my gear, and the woods. The forecast had said there might be a little rain, but I figured that was no big deal. I actually liked the idea. Rain seemed peaceful compared to the endless hum of city life. I packed everything carefully. My sturdy green tent, a sleeping bag, a foam pad, my heavy-duty waterproof jacket, a little camp stove, food, water, an emergency beacon, a headlamp, extra socks, a first aid kit, and my good knife. I didn't have a gun, but I wasn't too worried about that. I'd picked a spot where hunting wasn't allowed, and there were no large predators like bears known to roam around there. I left early on a Friday morning. The drive took about an hour and a half. I pulled off a back road into a muddy parking area, a patch cut into the edge of the forest, mostly used by hikers and hunters during the season. It was empty when I got there, not a single other car in sight. That gave me a small thrill. This was what I wanted, total peace and quiet. I strapped my pack on and started walking. The trail I picked wasn't on any major maps. It was one of those unofficial trails, barely more than a worn path of trampled grass and dirt, leading deeper into the forest. I knew the area well enough from studying satellite maps and old blogs from local hikers. After about 2 hours of hiking uphill, weaving through thick trees and stepping over wet fallen logs, I found the clearing I had picked out beforehand. It wasn't much, just a soft, grassy patch surrounded by thick trees, but it was flat, and it had a good view of the surrounding forest, perfect for my little setup. I spent the next hour setting up camp. I found a good spot a little higher up the slope, not too close to any big trees in case of falling limbs, but still tucked enough into the woods that I wouldn't stick out like a sore thumb. I got my tent pitched tight and threw my sleeping bag inside. I gathered a bunch of damp wood and small branches, trying to find the driest stuff I could under the thicker pines, and built a little fire ring out of stones. I knew the rain was probably coming, so I set up a makeshift tarp over the fire area using some paracord and a spare sheet of waterproof fabric. By late afternoon, I had a small fire going. It wasn't anything roaring, but it gave off a nice steady heat. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles and a few strips of beef jerky, and sat by the fire sipping hot tea from a metal cup, just watching the woods around me. I felt good. I felt calm. The light faded slowly, turning everything around me into that deep, rich green of the Pacific Northwest. The air smelled like wet earth and pine sap. Around dusk, the rain started. It was light at first, just a mist that dampened my jacket and made the fire sizzle quietly. I pulled my jacket hood tight and adjusted the tarp to make sure the fire wouldn't die out too fast. I knew I couldn't keep it going all night. I didn't have enough dry wood for that. But for now, it was comforting. As night fully settled in, the rain picked up. It turned from a mist into a steady patter, drumming against my tent and the leaves above. I put out the fire carefully, packed away all food into a bear-proof container, and zipped myself into the tent. I stripped off my wet outer layers and crawled into the sleeping bag, feeling that instant warmth creeping over me. The sound of rain filled the air, washing everything else away.
No engines, no voices, no beeping cell phones.
Just the endless rhythm of water falling through the trees. Took a long time for me to fall asleep. I wasn't scared exactly, just hyper-aware. Every crack of a branch in the distance made my ears perk up. Every gust of wind against the side of the tent made my heart skip a beat. It's one thing to be brave during the day when the woods are full of light. It's another thing at night when you can't see 5 feet in front of you and your mind starts playing tricks. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up suddenly to a sharp sound outside, like a crunch. Footsteps? I held my breath, my body freezing in place. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon nosing around the camp. I waited, straining my ears. The rain muffled everything, making it hard to tell what was what. After a minute or two of nothing, I finally let my muscles relax. Probably nothing, just my mind getting jumpy. I lay there in the dark, listening to the rain, feeling the slight unevenness of the ground under my sleeping pad. I might have dozed again, I don't know for how long, when another noise pulled me back awake. This one was closer and heavier, not a raccoon. The sound of something moving through the brush, deliberate, slow. Too slow to be a deer, which usually move in quick, darting steps. Sounded more like someone walking, I could feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck. My hand crept to the handle of my knife, still sheathed beside my sleeping bag. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I stared up at the ceiling, wide-eyed, every nerve in my body firing. Whoever or whatever it was, they didn't say anything.
No lights. No voices.
Just the sound of heavy breathing, almost inaudible over the rain. But there, if you listened hard enough. I waited and waited. Maybe a full 5 minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then the steps moved again, this time circling slowly around the tent. I gripped the knife tighter, the metal slick in my palm. What do? Stay still? Yell? Run? I remembered all the advice I'd read. If you don't know what's outside your tent, don't engage. Don't make yourself a target. I stayed frozen, heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. The steps faded after another long minute. They moved off into the woods, swallowed up by the rain. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, flinching at every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves. By the time the gray light of morning started to seep through the trees, I was still lying there, knife clutched in my sweaty hand, pulse pounding in my ears. Finally, when it was light enough to see shapes through the thin fabric of the tent, I dared to unzip the door a few inches. The forest looked normal.
Wet.
Misty. Empty. I forced myself to crawl out, every muscle stiff from lying tense for so long. I looked around carefully, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Not boot prints. Not animal tracks. Bare feet. Someone had walked around my camp in the middle of the night barefoot in the rain and mud. My stomach twisted. I packed up fast. Sloppier than I would have liked, but I didn't care. I stuffed everything into my pack, barely even bothering to fold the tent properly. I checked everything twice, making sure I hadn't left any trash or gear behind, and then I hit the trail as fast as I could manage, half jogging down the slippery path. The hike back felt like it took twice as long as the hike in. Every sound made me whip my head around. Every dark shape behind the trees made me jump. But nothing followed me. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear any more footsteps. I reached my car by late morning. The lot was still empty except for my old Subaru. I threw my gear into the back, peeled off my muddy jacket, and got behind the wheel, locking the doors immediately. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. But the woods stayed still and silent, swallowed up by the mist. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, back in the noise and the safety of other people. Took me a long time to feel normal again. For days after, I kept waking up at night thinking I heard footsteps outside my apartment window. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart leap into my throat. I never figured out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was a homeless person living rough in the woods. Maybe it was someone else camping illegally. Maybe it was something worse. I don't know, but I do know one thing. If you ever decide to camp alone, especially in the rain when everything feels just a little bit quieter, a little bit closer, remember that the forest isn't always empty, even when it looks like it is. And some things, some people, don't make a sound until they're already standing right outside your tent. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never, ever in the rain again. I was 27 when I decided to do something most people would call stupid. It was late October 2019, and the days were starting to get short. I had just quit my job at a car parts warehouse in Wilmington, North Carolina. I was feeling restless, like I needed to shake up my life somehow. I had a little savings set aside, not a lot, but enough to survive for a few months without a steady paycheck. Instead of job hunting right away, I decided to take some time for myself. That's when the idea popped into my head. I wanted to camp somewhere strange, different, somewhere most people would never dream of spending the night. That's how I ended up thinking about the old Winder graveyard, a place about an hour outside of the city. I had heard about it growing up. It was way out past the farms and the old textile mill ruins, tucked between a crumbling dirt road and a stretch of thick woods that nobody bothered to log anymore. It wasn't a famous place, just a forgotten patch of graves from the 1800s. No caretaquirs, no lights, no fences. The kind of place where nature was slowly taking everything back. Most folks in town avoided it, of course. They whispered about it, calling it haunted or cursed. I didn't believe in any of that crap. I never had. To me, it just sounded quiet, peaceful, and empty. Exactly what I needed. I packed up my old Ford Ranger with the essentials. A tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a heavy coat, a flashlight, extra batteries, a big jug of water, some granola bars, and a little propane stove. I also tossed in my old hunting knife, not because I thought I'd need it, but just because it felt smart to have something with a blade. You never know what you might run into out there. Maybe a wild dog, maybe just your own nerves. I drove out mid-afternoon so I could find a good spot before it got dark. The road got worse the further I went, turning from cracked pavement to gravel, then gravel to dirt. My tires crunched slowly along the winding path, the trees pressing closer on either side until it felt like I was driving into a tunnel made of gnarled old branches. Finally, I found the break in the trees where the graveyard was supposed to be. There wasn't any sign or anything. You just had to know where it was. I pulled off the road onto the grassy shoulder, grabbed my pack, and locked up the truck. I figured it'd be fine. Who would be out here? The entrance to the graveyard wasn't really an entrance at all. Just a gap in the underbrush where a few worn stones peeked out from the grass. I pushed through the weeds and found myself standing among the graves. Most of the headstones were leaning at crazy angles, worn smooth by rain and time. Some had fallen over completely. A few were so cracked that they were basically just slabs of rock lying in the dirt. The names were hard to read, but I could make out a few dates here and there. 1843, 1857, 1861. Some of the graves were marked with nothing more than a simple wooden cross, now black with rot. It was quiet, real quiet. The only sounds were the rustle of dry leaves in the wind and the occasional caw of a distant crow. No traffic.
No airplanes. No voices.
It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I picked a spot near the back of the graveyard, away from the road and tucked between two big cedar trees. The ground there was mostly flat, and there weren't any graves right on top of it, at least not that I could see. I set up my tent carefully, double-checking the stakes. It was supposed to get cold that night, and the last thing I wanted was the wind pulling my shelter down. Once the tent was up, I sat on the ground and just took it all in. The sun was setting fast, and the sky was turning a deep orange behind the black silhouettes of the trees. I boiled some water on the little stove and made a cup of instant coffee. Tasted like dirt, but it was hot and that was enough. Darkness fell fast. 1 minute it was dim, the next it was pitch black. I turned on my flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the dark like a sword. The light made the shadows stretch and move in strange ways. Every crooked headstone, every twisted branch looked more alive somehow, more deliberate. I tried not to let my imagination get the better of me. It was just a graveyard, just a bunch of old rocks and dead trees. Nothing could hurt me here. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just because I was alone in a weird place at night, but that didn't make it go away. Every little noise, a twig snapping, a leaf skittering across the ground, made my heart jump a little. I ate a granola bar and drank some water, sitting close to the tent where the flashlight lit everything up nice and bright. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to turn in. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent closed tight, and turned off the flashlight. For a while, I just lay there listening. The wind had died down, and the night was so still it almost hurt my ears. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was wide awake, heart hammering in my chest. Something had woken me up. I didn't know what. I stayed still, straining my ears. I could hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They were close. Too close. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, shining it around inside the tent. Nothing there. I unzipped the door just enough to poke the flashlight outside. The graveyard looked the same. Empty, dark, still. But the footsteps had stopped the second I turned the light on. Like whoever or whatever had been walking around didn't want to be seen. I sat there for a long time, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, just staring out into the darkness. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal. A deer maybe even just the wind shifting something. I told myself that until I almost believed it. I zipped the tent back up and lay down again, but I didn't sleep. Not really. I just drifted in and out of shallow dreams, always half awake, always listening. Sometime later, I didn't know if it was minutes or hours, I heard it again. Footsteps. Only this time they were right outside the tent, inches away. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. I heard a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. Then a soft thud. Then nothing. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Finally, I worked up the nerve to move. I flicked on the flashlight again, yanked the tent open, and shined the beam outside. There was something sitting just outside the tent. It was a small wooden cross, old and rotten like the ones marking some of the graves. Only it hadn't been there before. I swung the light around wildly, looking for whoever had left it, but the graveyard was empty. Totally, completely empty. I snatched up the cross and looked at it closely. There were no markings, no names, just rough wood, splintered and cracked. I tossed it away and packed up my stuff as fast as I could. I didn't even bother folding the tent. I just ripped the stakes out and stuffed everything into my pack. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the zipper closed. I booked it back to the truck, crashing through the underbrush like a bull. I unlocked the door, threw my gear into the bed, and jumped in. When I turned the key, the engine groaned but didn't start. My stomach dropped. I tried again. Nothing. I sat there in the dark, breathing hard, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I remembered then that I had an old jump starter pack under the seat. I fumbled for it, my fingers clumsy with panic. I hooked it up to the battery, said a quick silent prayer, and tried the ignition one more time. The engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I threw the truck into gear and tore out of there, tires spitting dirt and gravel. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, where the lights of other cars made me feel halfway human again. I drove straight home, dumped my gear in the garage, and locked every door and window in the house. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat on the couch, staring at nothing, jumping at every little noise. In the morning, I went out to check the truck. Mud and leaves were stuck all over the undercarriage, but otherwise it looked fine. Except for one thing. On the hood, scratched deep into the paint, were two words: go home. No footprints.
No handprints.
No signs of anyone messing around. Just those two words, burned into the metal like a warning. I never went back to Winder Graveyard after that. I never even drove down that road again. I don't tell many people this story, because most of them would just laugh or call me crazy. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I know I was never supposed to be there. I was 27 years old when I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep into the woods near La Pine, Oregon. It was October 2021, and the air was starting to bite a little colder than it had in summer. I needed the break badly. Work had been a mess for months. Way too many hours stuck behind a screen, answering emails, taking calls, solving other people's problems. My head felt like it had been trapped inside a buzzing beehive for too long. I figured getting out there alone would clear my mind. No phone service, no noise, no people. Just trees, dirt, the river, and me. I packed carefully, making sure I had everything. Sleeping bag, tent, extra layers of clothing, a small gas stove, a good flashlight, extra batteries, first aid kit, plenty of food, water purification tablets, a survival knife, and a can of bear spray just in case. I also brought an old .22 rifle my uncle had given me years ago. I wasn't planning to hunt, but it felt smarter to have something more than just a knife if anything went wrong. The spot I chose wasn't at a real campground. It was about a 6-mile hike from the nearest gravel road, along a worn deer trail through thick forest. I had found it a few years back while backpacking with friends and saved the location on my GPS. No markers, no signs, just a clearing close to a slow-moving bend in the river, with a small rocky outcrop that caught the sunset perfectly. The hike in was tough. The trail narrowed in places until I had to push through thick underbrush. There were downed trees I had to climb over, and the occasional steep hill where my legs burned with every step. But once I made it to the clearing and dropped my pack, I felt that familiar flood of peace wash over me. The river chuckled softly nearby. The wind moved through the trees like whispers. It was perfect. I set up my tent near the treeline, close enough for some shelter from the wind, but not so close that a branch could fall on me if a storm kicked up. After getting camp set up, I boiled some water for coffee and sat on a big flat rock overlooking the river. The sun dipped low, turning the water and the trees a fiery gold. For the first time in months, my chest didn't feel tight. I just sat there for a long time, breathing, listening, feeling the chill settle into the air. That first night passed without anything unusual. I crawled into my sleeping bag early, lulled by the sound of the river and the wind. The cold woke me up a few times, and I had to pull my hat lower over my ears, but nothing else disturbed me. The next morning, I woke just before sunrise. The world outside was gray and damp, and the grass was slick with dew. I heated up some instant oatmeal and sipped coffee from a metal mug, watching mist curl over the river. There were fresh deer tracks near my campsite, and I caught sight of a buck moving quietly through the trees across the water. It all felt wild and right. After breakfast, I strapped on a small day pack and decided to explore upriver. I followed game trails through the woods, crossing over fallen logs, skirting around patches of thick brush. The river wound through valleys and cliffs, sometimes hidden behind walls of trees, sometimes opening up into broad, rocky beaches. I lost track of time wandering like that, and by the time I decided to head back to camp, the sun was starting its slow dip toward the horizon again. When I got back to my campsite, something felt different. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. Everything looked the same. My tent was still where I pitched it. My backpack leaned against the rock. The small pile of wood I had collected earlier was untouched. But the more I stood there, the heavier the feeling got. It was like a low, crawling discomfort in my stomach, something ancient warning me that something wasn't right. I checked around carefully. Nothing looked disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I told myself maybe it was just the growing darkness or the fact that I was alone. It was easy to spook yourself out there. Still, that night I made sure to build a bigger fire. I kept my rifle closer to my sleeping bag. I listened harder to the sounds around me. Every snap of a twig, every shift of the wind. Eventually, I drifted off, but it was a restless sleep. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside my tent. I froze. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or even a deer. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sound was slow, deliberate, heavy, not the quick, curious snuffling of a raccoon or the light steps of a deer. It sounded like boots. I slid my hand slowly toward the rifle. My heart hammered so hard it felt like my chest would rip open. I lay there for what felt like forever, listening to the soft crunch of footsteps circling my tent. They paused by the door flap. I could hear breathing. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the rifle tight, the safety already off. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I waited at least another hour, ears straining in the dark, before I finally dared to move. I didn't sleep again. When the sky finally started to pale with dawn, I climbed out of the tent, rifle in hand. The ground was damp with dew, and I could clearly see the prints around my tent. They were boot prints, big ones. They circled my tent twice, then wandered off toward the treeline. I packed up camp in record time. As much as I wanted to believe it was just some other hiker or hunter passing through, something about the way those steps circled my tent, stopping right at the door, chilled me deeper than the cold morning air. I decided not to go back the way I came. Instead, I cut through the forest at an angle that would lead me back to the main gravel road quicker, even if it meant bushwhacking through dense undergrowth. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and whoever had been out there. The hike was brutal. The land sloped sharply in places. Thorn bushes tore at my jeans and jacket. At one point, I had to wade across a chest-deep section of river that nearly swept me off my feet. But I didn't stop, not even to catch my breath. The feeling that I was being followed gnawed at me constantly. Every now and then, I'd hear something behind me. The soft snap of a branch, the crunch of a step, and every hair on my body would stand on end. I would stop, listen, rifle raised, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything. The woods were thick and the shadows deep. If someone wanted to stay hidden, it wouldn't have been hard. I finally stumbled onto the gravel road just before sunset. My legs were shaking, my throat dry, and my boots soaked through. I followed the road another 2 miles until I found the spot where I had hidden my car under some brush. My hands were trembling so bad I dropped my keys twice before I finally got the door open. I drove out of there faster than I probably should have on those winding back roads, not stopping until I hit the main highway. I didn't tell anyone what had happened when I got home. It sounded crazy even to me. No proof, no confrontation, just boot prints and a feeling. But that feeling was real. I could still feel it crawling under my skin days later. A week after I got back, I decided to check the news for anything weird happening in that area. At first, I didn't find much, but then I stumbled onto a small local article. It mentioned that a hunter had gone missing in the same forest, not far from where I had been camping. His truck had been found abandoned at a trailhead, and no sign of him had turned up despite search efforts. They never found him. I don't know if it was connected. I tell myself it probably wasn't, that it was just a coincidence, that the man circling my tent was just another lost hiker, or maybe a hunter checking my camp for signs of his missing friend. But I don't go camping alone anymore. Every time I think about going back into the woods, even with friends, I feel that cold knot tighten in my stomach again. That feeling of heavy footsteps in the dark. The soft breathing outside the thin layer of nylon. The woods are still beautiful, still wild, still peaceful, but now I know they're not empty. I was 29 when I decided to take that camping trip to France. It was 2018, and life had been wearing me down in ways I didn't even realize until I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't recognize myself. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship. Work felt like it was squeezing every part of me dry, and my phone buzzed so much I felt like smashing it half the time. I needed out. Out of the noise, the city, the crowds, everything. I picked a small place called Le Bois Diamant, tucked close to the Swiss border, far enough away from anything touristy. It wasn't a fancy area. It was forests, dirt roads, hills that stretched out like giant waves, small farms, a few creaky cabins, and the smell of wood smoke hanging in the air. Perfect for what I wanted, nobody around. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, a little food, water filter, a knife I mostly brought to feel a little safer, and a map since I knew cell service would be spotty out there. I didn't plan a detailed route. I just marked a few lakes I thought I might want to see and told myself I'd follow the good weather. It was early October, right when the forests were starting to turn. The air had that sharp edge in the mornings that made your breath show. But by the afternoons it was still warm enough that you could hike in a t-shirt. I loved it. The first few days were peaceful. I hardly saw another person. I'd pass an old farmer driving a truck packed with firewood, or wave to a shepherd walking with his dog. But that was about it. Most of the time, it was just me and the crunch of my boots through leaves, the sound of wind threading through the trees, and the smell of wet earth. On the third night, I found a spot near a small stream. The banks were muddy and the water ran fast over smooth rocks. But there was a dry patch tucked under some pines where I could set up my tent. I made a little fire to cook some food, just a cheap can of stew heated in a battered pot, and sat back against my backpack watching the flames spit and hiss. The stars came out sharp and cold. I sat there for a long time, thinking about nothing, just letting myself exist in the quiet. I slept good that night. The next morning was when it started to feel different. I woke up early. The air was heavy with mist, the trees dripping. I packed up and decided to head toward a bigger lake I'd seen on the map. Maybe spend a day or two there before turning back toward the village. I figured it would take about half a day of hiking. About 2 hours into it, winding through a thick stretch of woods, I caught sight of someone ahead of me on the trail. It was a woman. At first, I barely thought anything of it. It was public forest, after all. She was standing just off the trail, half behind a tree. She wore a heavy brown coat that hung all the way to her knees, with a hood pulled up over her head, and I could see long strands of hair blowing out from under it. Her clothes looked worn out, like she'd been living rough for a while. She wasn't carrying a backpack or anything else that I could see. I slowed down just a little. Something about the way she stood there bothered me. She wasn't hiking. She wasn't gathering wood or picking berries or anything you might expect. She was just standing there, half hidden, like she didn't want to be seen but wasn't quite trying hard enough. I kept walking, trying not to stare, but I couldn't shake it. I glanced back once after I passed, and she was still there, watching me. I picked up my pace a little. The trail was narrow and wound deeper into the woods. I didn't see her again that morning, but the feeling stuck with me like a piece of a bad dream you can't shake off. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just hiking too. Maybe she was waiting for someone. Maybe she was just weird. Not my problem. Still, when I made camp that night by the lake, I set my tent deeper into the trees than I normally would have. I didn't build a fire either. I ate some dry bread and cheese and crawled into my sleeping bag before it even got fully dark. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of branches snapping. It wasn't a deer. I grew up around woods and I know what animals sound like. This was slow, deliberate. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I stayed dead still, heart hammering in my ears. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and heavy. I could hear breathing, raspy and close. I gripped the knife inside my sleeping bag and held my breath. After what felt like hours but was probably just a few minutes, the sounds moved off into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, stiff with fear, until the sky started to lighten. When morning came, I packed up fast. I barely even ate. I checked around my campsite. No tracks I could see, but the ground was rocky and dry here. It wouldn't have taken much to hide footprints. I told myself I was just spooking myself, that it was an animal or maybe another camper wandering around drunk. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I pushed hard that day, hiking way farther than I normally would. I just wanted to get back to the village, to people. I didn't even care about the trail anymore. I cut across rough hills through heavy brush, getting scratched up and tired and sweaty. Late in the afternoon, I found an old logging road and started following it. It was easier walking, and I figured it would eventually lead to somewhere. I walked for hours. The sun dipped low. I was thinking about finding a spot to camp when I saw something up ahead. An old shack. It looked abandoned, sagging under its own weight. The wood blackened and split by years of rain and wind. The windows were broken out, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Still, it was shelter. I crept up carefully, knife in hand, heart pounding. I pushed the door open with the tip of the blade. Empty. Inside, it smelled like mold and old fire smoke. There was a crumbling fireplace against one wall, a broken chair, and piles of dead leaves blown in through the broken windows. I decided I'd rather risk a night here than in the open. I set up my sleeping bag in a corner away from the windows, ate a little food, and tried to settle down. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. Night fell like a stone. First, it was quiet. Just the usual night sounds, wind rattling the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps again. Crunch, crunch, slow, steady. I sat up, heart hammering. Through the broken window, I could see a shape moving outside. It was her, the woman from the trail. She moved stiffly, almost awkwardly, like her legs didn't bend right. Her coat hung off her like a wet rag. She stopped about 10 feet from the shack and just stood there. I watched, frozen. She raised one arm, slow, shaking, and pointed directly at the shack. At me. I ducked down, heart slamming so hard it hurt. I clutched the knife, breathing through my mouth. Minutes passed. When I dared to peek again, she was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there with my back against the wall, knife in my lap, every nerve screaming. I kept thinking about that pointing gesture. It wasn't random. She knew I was there. As soon as it got light enough to see, I bolted. I didn't bother packing neatly. I just stuffed everything into my bag and ran. I stuck to the road even though it made me feel exposed. I figured if I kept moving, I'd hit the village sooner or later. Hours passed. My legs ached. My throat was dry. My stomach gnawed at itself. Then, up ahead, I saw a sign. Faded and leaning, but it had the name of the village I was heading for. 6 kilometers. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I pushed on, feeling lighter with every step. When I finally stumbled into the village, just a few small stone houses, a church, and a bakery, I didn't stop. I went straight to the tiny inn on the main street. The woman at the front desk gave me a strange look when I walked in covered in dirt and leaves, but I didn't care. I got a room, locked the door, and finally let myself breathe. I stayed there for 2 days, sleeping, eating, trying to stop looking over my shoulder every 5 minutes. I didn't see the woman again. When I asked around, carefully, nobody knew of anyone like her. No missing hikers. No strange women living in the woods. Maybe she was some hermit, someone who'd lost her mind living alone out there. Maybe she just wanted to scare me off. Maybe she didn't like strangers in her forest. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I wasn't going back into those woods. Not ever. When I finally left, driving back down the narrow, winding roads toward the city, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing by the side of the road. But she wasn't there. Still, even now, years later, sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that woman. The way she stood there, pointing at me through the broken window, and my stomach twists up the same way it did that night. Some places, some people you're just not meant to find. And if you do, you're better off running and never looking back. It was early October 2014 when I decided to get away for a few days. I was 27 back then, working a stressful job in St. Louis, Missouri. My head felt packed with noise all the time, and I couldn't seem to think clearly anymore. I figured a short camping trip would help. Somewhere quiet, somewhere out of the way. I drove out to Mark Twain National Forest, a few hours south. I had been there before a couple of times as a teenager with my dad. He showed me all the old trails and hidden spots back then. This time, though, I wanted something even more remote. I pulled off the main roads and headed down dirt paths that barely showed up on GPS. The truck rumbled over potholes and rocks. The trees thickened on either side of the road until it felt like I was tunneling deeper into the woods. I passed a few broken down trail markers, but no signs of campsites or other people, which was exactly what I wanted. After about an hour, I found a clearing. It looked like someone had camped there maybe weeks ago. An old fire pit ringed by stones, some logs pushed into seats, a few rusted beer cans scattered around. It wasn't official, but it would do. I parked the truck and got out. The air smelled wet and heavy, like old leaves and moss. Above me, the sky was thick with low clouds. It was colder than I expected. I zipped up my jacket and pulled my gear out of the truck bed. Setting up camp took most of the afternoon. I pitched my small green tent under a big oak tree, close enough to the truck in case I needed something but far enough that it felt like I was actually camping. I gathered wood from the surrounding area and stacked it neatly near the fire pit. I had brought a couple of thick army surplus blankets, a big metal flashlight, and an old hunting knife my grandfather had given me years ago. By the time everything was ready, the sun had already dipped low behind the trees. The woods around me grew darker, colder. I lit a small fire and cooked some canned chili over it, eating straight from the pot with a plastic spoon. It tasted better out there, with the cold biting at my fingers and the heat of the fire warming my face. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire for a long time just listening. The woods creaked and shifted in the wind. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted. Little sounds floated through the trees, sticks snapping, dry leaves scuttling across the ground. It was natural.
Familiar.
When the fire burned down to coals, I climbed into the tent, zipped it up tight, and burrowed into my blankets. I drifted off to sleep quickly, tired from the drive and setup. I woke once in the night. It was dead silent outside, too silent. I lay there for a long moment, heart pounding in my chest, trying to figure out what had woken me. No wind.
No bugs.
Nothing. Eventually, the normal forest noises crept back. An occasional rustle, a drip of water from a branch. I told myself I was being paranoid and fell back asleep. The next day, I decided to hike a little. I left most of my gear back at the campsite, bringing only a small pack with water, a compass, and a granola bar. I wandered through the woods, cutting through thickets and stepping over fallen logs. There was no trail to follow. I just trusted my sense of direction and kept a mental note of landmarks. A bent cedar tree, a mossy boulder shaped like a heart. The forest felt endless. Sometimes it opened into small clearings where the sun broke through, but mostly it was thick, shadowy, and still. At one point, I found the remains of an old wooden fence, mostly collapsed and rotted. Maybe there had been farms out here once, a long time ago. It made the place feel even more forgotten. After a few hours, I circled back toward camp. I wasn't exactly sure where I was, but I had a good enough sense of direction to figure it out. When I got back, the fire pit and tent were exactly as I had left them. Nothing seemed disturbed. Still, I felt uneasy, like something had changed, but I couldn't say what. I shook it off, probably just the isolation getting to me. I spent the afternoon gathering more firewood, stacking it high. I figured I'd make a big fire that night, sit out as long as I could, and enjoy the quiet. By dusk, the clouds had thickened even more. The air felt damp and heavy, like it might rain. I got the fire going early, throwing on bigger logs to build up a good base. The orange glow pushed back the darkness a little, but beyond the reach of the light, the woods seemed to press in harder. Sitting by the fire, I watched the flames flicker and dance. I chewed on some beef jerky, sipping from a battered metal flask of whiskey I had brought. It was cold enough that my breath showed in the air. That's when I noticed it. Movement, just beyond the circle of light. It was quick, almost like a trick of the eye, a flash of something pale between the trees. My body stiffened. I sat perfectly still, listening. Nothing. The forest had gone quiet again. That same heavy silence from the night before. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer. Maybe a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. I threw another log on the fire and poked at it with a stick, trying to act normal. Every few minutes, I'd glance up at the woods, trying to catch another glimpse. An hour passed, maybe more. The fire burned high and bright. Eventually, the fear ebbed a little. I figured if it was something dangerous, a bear, maybe it would have shown itself by now. I started to relax again, enjoying the warmth. Then, just as I was thinking about turning in for the night, I saw it again. A figure. This time, there was no mistaking it. A man, standing just beyond the light, watching me. I couldn't make out his face, only the shape of him. Tall, thin, wearing some kind of jacket. He stood perfectly still, half hidden by a tree, like he was trying to blend in. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would break my ribs. I stayed seated. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched him, pretending not to see. Minutes passed, maybe more. The man didn't move, didn't come closer, just stood there. I felt trapped. I couldn't run, not into the woods at night. I couldn't drive away without getting to the truck, and I'd have to pass near him to reach it. I couldn't even scream. Who would hear me out here? The fire crackled and popped. Sparks floated up into the dark like tiny stars. Finally, after what felt like forever, the man turned and slipped silently back into the trees. Gone. I sat there shaking. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to leave. Now, I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing my sleeping bag and gear into the truck with trembling hands. I didn't even bother folding the tent. Just ripped the stakes out of the ground and shoved the whole thing into the bed. The entire time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him again. When I finally climbed into the cab and slammed the door, I locked it immediately. My keys were in my pocket, thank God. I jammed them into the ignition and cranked the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the empty clearing. I didn't see anyone. I threw the truck into reverse and backed out fast, tires crunching over gravel and fallen leaves. Then I shifted into drive and sped down the dirt road, the truck bouncing and jolting with every rut and pothole. Branches scraped the sides. Rocks clattered against the undercarriage. I didn't care. I just wanted out. It felt like forever before I hit the main gravel road again. When I did, I didn't stop. I kept going, pushing the truck faster than I should have, tires fishtailing slightly on the loose surface. Only when I reached the paved road did I finally slow down. I pulled over for a second, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My whole body was shaking. I sat there for a long moment, breathing hard. Finally, I started driving again, heading north, back toward civilization. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached a cheap motel on the outskirts of some small town. I checked in, paid cash, and locked the door behind me. I pushed a chair under the doorknob and slept with the lights on. The next day, in the safety of daylight, I thought about calling the sheriff's office, reporting the man. But what would I say? That I saw someone standing in the woods? That he didn't do anything except watch? There was no crime in that. Just me, alone in the woods, and someone else who wasn't supposed to be there. I never went back to that part of the forest. Never even thought about it much after that. Life got busy again. Work, bills, relationships. It all filled my head until the memory faded like an old dream. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I think about it again. I wonder how long he had been there, watching me, and what would have happened if I hadn't seen him when I did. I took the job at Boulder Creek National Park back in 2018, a few months after I turned 31. I had just left a desk job in Dallas, tired of sitting under fluorescent lights all day and staring at spreadsheets. I wanted something different, something outdoors, something that felt real. When I saw the listing for seasonal park rangers up north in Montana, I jumped at it. I packed up my beat-up Silverado and drove north until the pine forests thickened and the air smelled like sap and cold rock. The park was beautiful. Massive spreads of thick woods, clear lakes that reflected the sky like mirrors, rocky trails that twisted up through old mountains. Most of the job was what you'd expect. Checking trailheads, patrolling the lakes, cleaning up after the idiots who left beer cans behind. I didn't mind it. I liked the long walks through the woods. I liked sitting by the ranger station with a cup of coffee and feeling like the world had slowed down. By mid-September, the summer crowds had thinned out. It was quieter. The families went home, the college kids packed up their tents. You got a few hunters, a few loners who liked the woods in the fall. And then you had the weirdos, the people who thought living off the grid meant digging holes and stashing jars of peanut butter in the woods. We kept an eye out for those types. That year, my supervisor asked me to do an overnight patrol out near the old Bear Run backcountry sites. Bear Run was about 7 miles from the nearest parking lot, deep in the trees. Not a lot of people went out that far unless they really wanted to be alone. That was part of the job, making sure no one got hurt or decided to start fires where they shouldn't. The plan was simple: hike out in the afternoon, set up a camp, patrol the area, and hike back the next morning. Easy enough. I packed light: my tent, a sleeping bag, some food, a stove, my first aid kit, a few flares, my radio, my sidearm, standard issue, mostly for animals, but we were trained for other situations too, and a big, heavy flashlight. It was already getting dark earlier in the evenings, so I made sure I had plenty of batteries. I left the ranger station around noon. The air was cool, dry, and crisp. Leaves were just starting to change. The trail to Bear Run wound through thick woods, mostly old pine, with some dense underbrush in places. After a mile or two, you felt like you were completely alone. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. Squirrels rustled in the underbrush. Every once in a while, I'd hear the distant knock of a woodpecker. I made good time. By 4 o'clock, I reached Bear Run. There were 3 small backcountry campsites, each marked with a worn wooden post. I picked the middle one, Site 2, mostly because it was closest to the little creek that snaked through the trees nearby. It wasn't much, just a patch of dirt, a fire ring, and a flat space for a tent. But it was enough. I set up my tent quickly. I didn't bother with a fire. Regulations said no fires this deep in the woods unless absolutely necessary, and instead boiled some water on my stove for a dehydrated pasta meal. As I sat on a log eating, the sun started to drop behind the trees. Shadows grew longer. The air cooled fast. After dinner, I cleaned up and started my patrol. I checked the other 2 campsites first. Both were empty. No sign anyone had been through here in a while. That was normal. Not a lot of foot traffic this late in the season. Once the sites were checked, I walked a wide loop through the woods around Bear Run. It was getting dark fast. I flicked on my flashlight and moved slowly, scanning the trees. Everything felt normal. The usual night sounds: crickets, owls, A faint rustle here and there as small animals moved through the underbrush. But about 30 minutes into my patrol, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A flash of movement, maybe 100 yards off the trail. Too big for a rabbit, too fast for a deer. I stopped and listened, heart picking up just a little. Nothing. I waited a full minute, standing still, breathing quietly. Still nothing. Could have been a bear. Could have been a coyote. Could have been my imagination. Either way, I wasn't about to go crashing off the trail in the dark, chasing shadows. I made a mental note to be alert and kept moving. I finished the patrol loop and got back to my tent around 8. It was full dark by then. No moon, just a thin smear of stars through the treetops. I zipped myself into the tent, checked my radio, still working, and lay back in my sleeping bag. The woods outside were alive with quiet sounds. Whined through the branches, leaves skittering across the ground. I drifted off after a while, the way you do when you're bone tired and there's nothing else to do. I woke up to a sound. It was subtle, barely there, but enough to snap me out of a dead sleep. A footstep, maybe two, close. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding. I listened. Nothing now, just the usual background noise. I unzipped the sleeping bag slowly, feeling for my flashlight with one hand. My fingers found it. I clicked it on and shined it around inside the tent. Empty, of course. I unzipped the door just a crack and peered out. Pitch black, trees, the glint of the creek maybe 20 yards off. I stepped out carefully, boots crunching softly on the dirt. I swung the beam of the flashlight in a slow arc around the clearing. Nothing, no footprints, no eye shine from animals, just the cold, empty woods. I stood there a long moment, every hair on my arm standing on end, before deciding it was probably an animal that had wandered close. Maybe a raccoon or a fox. I told myself that anyway. I crawled back inside, zipped the tent up tight, and tried to sleep again. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was colder and the forest outside had fallen weirdly silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing, dead quiet. I sat up, heart hammering. The silence wasn't right. Anyone who's spent real time in the woods knows that. It wasn't natural. It was the kind of quiet that meant something was nearby that didn't belong. I listened hard, straining my ears. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound of breathing. Not mine. Heavy, slow, coming from just outside the tent. I froze. The breathing stayed steady, slow, as if whoever, whatever it was didn't care if I heard. I moved silently, reaching for my sidearm. My fingers closed around the cold grip. I didn't draw it yet. I just kept my hand there. The breathing continued for maybe a full minute. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited another 10 minutes, barely breathing, before unzipping the tent again. The woods were dark and empty, no sign of anything. I shined the flashlight around, catching glimpses of trees, rocks, the gleam of the creek. Nothing. But when I swung the light back toward the trail that led out of Bear Run, I saw something. A shape, human, moving away down the trail. Not a camper, not someone with a pack or gear, just a figure, walking into the woods like they belonged there. I didn't shout. I didn't move. I just watched as the figure disappeared into the darkness. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting up in my tent with the flashlight on and the sidearm across my lap. When dawn finally broke, I packed up fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just broke camp, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started hiking out. The trail felt different in the daylight, less threatening. The sun filtered through the trees, lighting up the gold and red leaves. Birds chirped in the branches. Squirrels chattered from the treetops. But about 2 miles down the trail, I found something that made my stomach knot up. A shirt, just lying across the path. Torn, dirty, smudged with what looked like dried blood. Not a lot, just enough to know it wasn't ketchup or paint. I stood there a long moment, staring at it. Then I forced myself to step off the trail and look around. About 20 feet into the woods, I found more. A torn backpack, ripped open. Its contents, food wrappers, a smashed flashlight, a battered water bottle, scattered across the ground. No sign of the owner. I radioed it in immediately, giving my location and describing what I'd found. Dispatch told me to stay put. A team would come out. I waited there, pacing the trail, heart hammering, scanning the trees constantly. Took about 2 hours before the search team arrived. They spread out, combing the woods. They never found the owner of the backpack. Over the next few days, more rangers came out. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers. They found a few more things. A hat, a boot, but no body, no campsite, no sign of who it had been. Officially, it went down as missing person, presumed lost. Happens more often than people think, even in a place as beautiful as Boulder Creek. The woods are big. People make mistakes. They get turned around. They panic. But I knew better. I knew what I'd heard outside my tent. I knew what I'd seen, that shape walking down the trail in the middle of the night, like it was just out for a stroll. Whoever it was, whoever had been breathing outside my tent, they weren't lost. They weren't a victim. They belonged out there. They knew the woods better than I did. I put in for a transfer a month later. Took a post down in Arizona, at a desert park with wide open spaces and no thick forests. I told myself it was because I wanted a change of scenery, but really, it was because every night when I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the woods, moving away into the dark, as easy as walking down the sidewalk. I didn't want to know what would have happened if I hadn't stayed quiet that night, and I never wanted to hear that breathing outside my tent again. My name's Caleb, and back in September 2022, I went camping with my dog, Max. I was 27 years old then, working a boring IT job in San Antonio, Texas. After months of sitting behind a computer, I felt like I needed to get away from the noise and stress. I loved the outdoors, but it had been years since I did any serious camping. I missed the feeling of sleeping under the stars, cooking over a fire, and just being in the middle of nowhere with no one bothering me. Max, my golden retriever, was about 4 years old at the time. He was a good dog, big, friendly, not too loud, and smart enough to listen when it mattered. He was used to long walks and weekend hikes, but I could tell he needed a real adventure as much as I did. So one Thursday evening, I packed up my old beat-up Toyota Tacoma with a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, a camp stove, a first aid kit, my hunting knife, a flashlight, and a few other essentials. Max's food and water bowls, his leash, and a thick blanket went into the back seat. I didn't bring a gun, stupid looking back, but I figured it was just going to be a relaxing trip. I wasn't heading deep into bear country or anything like that. The spot I picked was called Ashwood Creek, a small area tucked into the northern part of Texas, closer to Oklahoma. Not many people talked about it. I found it mentioned in an old online forum where people recommended lesser-known camping spots. The posts were from a few years back, and none of the recent hiking apps had much on it. It seemed perfect, out of the way, quiet, and overlooked. Exactly what I was after. I left early Friday morning. The drive took about 6 hours. I stopped at a gas station around noon, topped off my tank, grabbed a sandwich, and then drove another hour into back roads that eventually turned into gravel paths. Cell service disappeared about 30 minutes before I reached the creek. The deeper I got, the rougher the road became, overgrown branches scraping against the sides of my truck. I was bouncing along, tires kicking up dust and little rocks, Max sitting alert in the passenger seat, ears perked up. Finally, The trees opened up to a clearing with the narrow creek snaking through it. The water was low. Late summer droughts had made sure of that, but it still glimmered in the afternoon sun. Tall trees surrounded the clearing, their branches hanging heavy and dense. It looked peaceful, untouched. I parked close to the tree line, figuring it'd offer some shade. Max leapt out of the truck as soon as I opened the door, nose to the ground, tail wagging furiously. I let him explore while I set up the tent. It was a simple two-man tent, nothing fancy, just enough for me and Max to sleep comfortably. Setting up camp took about an hour. I hammered down the stakes, set up a small cooking area with rocks, gathered some firewood from the surrounding forest, and double-checked my gear. Everything looked good. Before sunset, I took Max for a walk along the creek. We followed a narrow game trail for about a mile, then turned back. We didn't see anyone else. No cars, no tents, no sounds of other people. Just the hum of insects and the occasional splash of a fish in the creek. That first night was exactly what I had hoped for. I made a simple dinner, canned chili warmed up on the stove, and fed Max his kibble. We sat by the fire, me sipping on a cheap beer, Max stretched out beside me, soaking in the heat. The sky above us was clear and filled with stars. It was perfect. I crawled into the tent around 10 p.m., Max curling up at my feet. I left the rain fly off so we could see the sky through the mesh. The night air was cool but not cold. I listened to the soft sounds of the forest as I drifted off. Crickets, a distant owl, the faint rustling of wind through the leaves. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. Max was sitting up, ears stiff, staring at the tent wall. His body was rigid, every muscle tense. At first, I thought he'd heard some animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer passing through. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I didn't hear anything unusual at first, just the normal night sounds. But Max kept staring. And then I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps, not far from the tent. Heavy, deliberate, not the quick, light steps of an animal. Someone was walking out there. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam pierced the dark mesh of the tent, but I couldn't see much. Just the dim shapes of the trees and the flicker of the fire I had let burn down to coals. I listened hard. Another crunch, and another. They were slow, spaced out, like whoever it was trying to be quiet. My heart thudded in my chest. I thought about calling out, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I stayed still, barely breathing. Max didn't growl or bark. He just stared, completely focused. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded. Whatever or whoever it was, they moved off into the woods. I sat there for a long time, listening, straining my ears. Nothing else came. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just some random hunter or hiker passing through. Maybe they didn't even see my tent. But it was hard to fall back asleep after that. The next morning, I found footprints around the camp. Human footprints. They circled the tent once, then headed back into the trees. They weren't mine. I had only walked a short distance from the truck to the tent. These prints were bigger, boot prints, maybe size 11 or 12. Fresh, from last night. My stomach twisted as I looked at them. I had the overwhelming feeling that whoever had been out there wasn't just passing through. They had been watching. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe it really had been just some hiker who got lost. Max seemed calm again, wagging his tail and sniffing around. So I decided to stay one more night. I figured if anything else weird happened, I'd leave first thing in the morning. During the day, I tried to keep busy. I went fishing in the creek, catching a few small trout. I cooked them up over the fire for lunch. Max splashed around in the water, chasing leaves and sticks. The sun was warm, and for a while I forgot about the footprints. The forest felt alive but peaceful. Late afternoon, I decided to explore a bit more. I strapped on my boots, grabbed a walking stick, and headed upstream with Max. We hiked for about 2 hours, following the winding creek, sometimes pushing through thick brush. I kept my bearings carefully. I didn't want to get lost out here with no cell service. Around 5 p.m., we stumbled across something strange. Clearing deeper in the woods. In the middle of it was a rough-looking campsite. A tarp strung between trees, a crude fire pit surrounded by stones, and a few empty cans and trash scattered around. It looked abandoned, but not old. Maybe a few days at most. Max growled low in his throat, his body stiff. He didn't like it here. I didn't either. Something felt off. I didn't go too close, just close enough to see that whoever had stayed here hadn't cleaned up. There was even a torn jacket lying half buried in the dirt, like someone had left in a hurry. I decided to turn back immediately. The hike back to my camp felt longer. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. Max stayed close to my side, ears flicking back and forth. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced we were being followed, but I didn't see anyone. We made it back just as the sun dipped below the trees. I rebuilt the fire high and bright, throwing on extra wood. I cooked a quick dinner, more canned food, and kept Max on his leash. I didn't want him wandering off. The woods felt different that night, heavier, watching. It was around 11 p.m. when it happened. I was sitting by the fire, Max lying next to me, when I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer. No attempt to hide them. Slow, heavy steps coming through the brush just beyond the firelight. My whole body tensed. Max stood up, growling deep and low, hackles raised. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the woods. For a second, I caught a glimpse. A figure, just at the edge of the trees. A man, tall, broad shoulders. I couldn't see his face. He stood there, half hidden by a tree, watching. I didn't move. I just stared back, heart hammering. Max barked once, loud and sharp. The man didn't move. He just stood there. I flicked the flashlight around, trying to get a better look. When I pointed it back, he was gone. Branches snapped somewhere to the left, then again farther away. Whoever it was, he was retreating but not running. I didn't waste any time. I doused the fire with dirt, packed up the essentials into the truck, shoved the tent and sleeping bag into the back without bothering to fold them properly. Max jumped into the passenger seat without needing to be told. I drove out of there as fast as I dared, headlights cutting through the darkness, gravel spitting out from under my tires. I didn't stop until I hit a paved road 2 hours later. When I finally pulled into a motel parking lot around 4 a.m., I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, heart still pounding. Max rested his head on my lap, sensing that something had been wrong. I checked the truck, made sure no one had followed me, then finally stumbled into the motel room with Max, locking the door behind me. I never found out who that man was. I don't know if he had been living out there, if he had just stumbled on my camp, or if he had been hunting for something or someone. But I do know this: trust your gut. And never camp alone in a place where you don't know who or what might be hiding in the trees. I haven't gone back to Ashwood Creek since. I don't plan to. It was the middle of September when I decided to take a solo camping trip. The weather was crisp but not too cold, perfect for an extended stay in the wilderness. I was 28 years old, a bit tired of the humdrum of city life, and desperate for some time alone in nature. The plan was simple: drive up to a remote spot in the Colorado Rockies, set up camp, and disconnect from everything for a few days. I found a quiet, almost forgotten trail that wasn't on the tourist radar. It was listed on a few obscure hiking blogs, but that was it. I parked my old Jeep at the trailhead, locked it, and adjusted my backpack, the straps digging into my shoulders. The hike wasn't difficult. maybe 5 miles to a small, secluded lake with a few campgrounds around it. It was far enough off the beaten path to make me feel like I was truly escaping, but close enough to civilization in case something went wrong. As I hiked, the dense forest closed in around me. Pine trees rose high, their needles rustling in the breeze. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled fresh, clean in a way I had forgotten was possible. The further I walked, the quieter it became. I didn't see another soul on the trail, and that gave me a strange sense of peace. When I finally reached the lake, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the water. The campsite was empty, as I had hoped. There were a few fire rings, and a wooden picnic table was situated near a small clearing that overlooked the lake. I unpacked quickly, setting up my tent beside the water and gathering wood for a fire. The sound of the crackling flames filled the air as the temperature dropped. As night settled in, the stillness of the forest around me seemed almost oppressive. The occasional sound of a distant owl, or the rustling of leaves as a squirrel scurried by, broke the silence. But otherwise, it was eerily quiet. I sat by the fire, the warmth on my face contrasting with the chill that had crept into the air. I was alone, but for the first time in what felt like months, it didn't bother me. The solitude was exactly what I needed. Around midnight, after the fire had died down to embers, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a branch snapping in the distance. I tensed, trying to listen more closely, but it didn't come again, and I told myself it was just the wind or an animal. The wind can be tricky in the mountains, and even the smallest noise can seem amplified in the silence of the night. But then, it happened again. A snap, followed by a slight rustle, closer this time. My heart rate quickened. I stood up, grabbed the flashlight from my bag, and turned it on. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Only the flickering shadows of the fire dancing on the forest floor. I told myself to calm down. It was probably a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But as I sat back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an uncomfortable pressure in my chest, like I was being watched. I sat there for a while, not daring to get up again. I felt the weight of the night closing in, and the sounds of the forest seemed to grow more distinct, more pronounced, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. There was no more rustling, no more snapping twigs. The wind had died down completely, leaving only an unsettling silence. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was just my imagination running wild. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight, trying to push the unease from my mind. My sleeping bag was warm, and I focused on the rhythmic sound of my breathing to lull myself to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The night stretched on. Every little noise made my heart race. The sound of wind against the tent sounded almost like whispers, though I knew it was just the fabric reacting to the breeze. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving outside the tent. Just flickers, nothing substantial, but enough to make my pulse spike. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. A distinct, heavy footstep, followed by the sound of someone, moving through the trees. It was slower this time, more deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was circling my campsite. The footsteps were soft but unmistakable, as though they were aware of the need to be quiet. I lay still, my breathing shallow, trying to figure out what to do. I told myself it was probably another hiker, though I couldn't understand why someone would be out here at this hour. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just another hiker. Felt different, felt wrong. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hands shaking as I fumbled for it in the dark. I unzipped the tent just enough to stick the light out, shining it in every direction. My heart dropped when I saw nothing. The trees swayed in the wind, but otherwise the area was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the beam of light, waiting. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing with every possible scenario. Was it a person, a bear, or something worse? But nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I convinced myself to go back to sleep. I needed to rest if I was going to hike out in the morning. I lay there in the dark, waiting for the tension in my body to ease, but sleep remained elusive. The unease clung to me like a shadow. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved. The sky was just beginning to lighten, and the forest was still. I packed my things quickly, eager to leave. The hike out felt long, even though it was mostly downhill. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But when I reached the trailhead, I felt a weight lift from my chest. The peaceful morning light was the most welcome thing I had seen in days. I never did figure out what had been out there that night, but I had learned something about myself. The wilderness, no matter how beautiful, can also be disorienting and strange, especially when you're alone. And sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions. It was October of 2016, and I was 33 years old. I remember that clearly because it was right after I left my job in construction and decided to take a few weeks to myself. My back had been giving me trouble from years of hauling lumber and crawling through tight framing, and I needed the break. I lived in northern Idaho back then, just outside a small town called Bonners Ferry. Most people haven't heard of it unless they're from the area or maybe passing through on the way to Canada. I decided to go camping that weekend, something I hadn't done in almost 2 years. The idea was to drive out alone, set up by a lake, and let the woods clear my head. I didn't want to go to a campground or anywhere people usually pitch tents. I wanted quiet, no RVs, no families with kids yelling, no one asking to borrow firewood. I just wanted some time where I didn't have to think about bills or aching joints or what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I packed light but smart. A canvas tent that I'd had for years, one that rolled tight and didn't take up much room. A heavy-duty sleeping bag rated down to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, since the nights were already getting cold that time of year. A small propane stove, 2 small tanks. A hatchet, a foldable saw, my knife. A few freeze-dried meals, trail mix, some jerky, a small cooler with a 6-pack of beer and some sandwiches. I also brought my .357 revolver, not because I expected to use it, but because the bears were still roaming and I wasn't stupid. I drove my truck northwest out of town and then took an old service road I remembered from some hunting trips with my uncle when I was a kid. It was still there, though barely, overgrown and washed out in places, but the truck handled it fine in low gear. The road climbed slowly, winding into the hills until I found a place flat enough to park. From there, I hiked another 20 minutes on foot through thick forest until I found a clearing. It wasn't near any marked trails or streams that I could see, just a flat spot with some older stumps and enough room to pitch a tent and keep a fire going. I was surrounded by tall firs and some yellowing aspens, and through a break in the trees I could see a sliver of a lake down the hill. I set up camp by late afternoon. The clouds had already started to move in, dark and heavy. The air was cold and smelled of damp leaves and moss. I set up the tent, cleared a fire ring, stacked some wood from a few dead limbs I saw nearby, and then got a fire going. I cooked one of the freeze-dried meals on the stove and ate it sitting on a log, watching the light fade through the trees. It was quiet except for the occasional bird or rustle of squirrels. The wind came in slow waves, rustling the leaves and hissing through the needles. By the time I had cleaned up and stowed my food away in a bear bag hung from a tree, it was almost dark. Then the rain started, not hard at first, just a slow drizzle. I stayed by the fire a while, huddled in my jacket, and when the wind picked up and the rain started to fall heavier, I zipped into my tent and crawled into the sleeping bag with a flashlight and a paperback. I read maybe 10 pages before the sound of the rain on the tent grew too loud, and I put the book away and just listened. There was something calming about being cocooned in the sleeping bag, hearing the rain patter on the canvas, knowing no one was around. At least I thought no one was around. Sometime later, maybe after I had dozed off for a bit, I woke up suddenly. Not from a noise exactly, but from a feeling. A change. I lay there still, listening. The rain was lighter now, almost misty, and I could hear it tapping gently. But something else had changed. I could hear a new sound, a crunch, like a soft footfall in wet leaves. I held my breath. Then again, a crunch. Pause. Another crunch. I didn't move. I tried to tell myself it was an animal. A deer maybe, but I knew deer moved differently. They stepped with grace and speed. This sounded careful, almost deliberate. The kind of step someone takes when they're trying not to be heard. I eased a hand out of the bag and reached for the revolver near the tent wall. I didn't unzip anything or make a sound. I just lay there holding it, finger off the trigger, listening. The steps came closer. There was a long pause, maybe 30 seconds, maybe more. Then something brushed against the side of the tent. It wasn't hard, just a gentle drag, like fingertips or a stick along the canvas. I stayed still. My heartbeat was so loud I thought it might be the only sound whoever was out there could hear. Another long pause. Then I heard it again. A light brushing, like someone trailing their hand across the tent as they walked around it. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't try to open the zipper or knock. They just circled once, brushing the tent wall, then stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. I didn't hear anything more, just the rain and my own breathing. Eventually, I drifted off again, not from relaxation but from sheer exhaustion. I must have been half awake for hours, jumping at every distant noise. But when I finally woke again, it was morning. The rain had stopped, and light was coming through the trees. I stepped outside with my revolver in hand. Everything was wet. The fire pit was soaked, and the wood I had stacked was half collapsed. I checked around the tent. There were footprints, faint and messy in the mud, barely visible. Definitely not mine. They circled once, close to the canvas, then veered off into the brush. I followed them a little ways, but they disappeared fast on the wet ground. Whoever had walked there had come quietly and left the same way. No trash, no markers, nothing stolen or damaged. It rattled me, more than I wanted to admit. I almost packed up and left then, but I didn't. I told myself it could have been a curious hiker, someone lost, maybe even a hunter, but in my gut, it didn't feel that way. I stayed one more night, but I didn't sleep much. I didn't light a fire or cook anything. Just sat inside the tent with the flap open a crack and listened to the forest breathe. I didn't hear the steps again, but the feeling stayed with me. The knowledge that someone else had come through those trees, had stood outside my tent in the rain and said nothing. The next morning I left early, took my time hiking back and then drove the truck home with the radio off, thinking about how small you feel when you're really alone in the woods, when there's no one around to yell for, when all you have between you and the night is a thin sheet of fabric. It was a few days later that I talked to a neighbor back home, a guy named Wes who was a volunteer with the local search and rescue. We were standing in line at the feed store, and I mentioned where I'd camped. He looked at me and frowned. "That old service road off Marble Ridge?" he said. I nodded. He shook his head slowly. "You hear about the guy went missing up there last month? Backpacker. Said he wanted to get away. Never came back. Search teams spent 2 weeks up there. Nothing but a burned out fire ring and his tarp. Vanished." I didn't say anything, just nodded and paid for my supplies. I still go camping, still take long hikes out where I know there won't be anyone for miles. But I don't sleep as easy anymore. I still bring the revolver. I bring extra batteries and a headlamp. I don't hang my food too far from camp anymore either, just close enough to get to it quick if I need to move. And I never camp on rainy nights alone now. Not after that. Because sometimes when it's quiet, when you think you've finally found a place to be at peace, you realize that peace is just the space between someone else's footsteps. And if they don't want to be found, you won't find them until they're right there, just on the other side of the fabric. Not saying a word, just listening to you breathe. I was 31 years old when I decided to spend a few days alone in the bush near a small river outside a town called Warrawong, in New South Wales. It was October 2016, and the weather had started to warm up but wasn't too hot yet. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship, and I needed to get away from my usual environment. I didn't want to be around anyone, not even friends or family. I just wanted some quiet, no phones, no screens, no drama. Just me, the trees, the water, and the sound of wind brushing through leaves. I loaded up my old Toyota Hilux with enough supplies for 4 nights. A tent, a sleeping bag, food, water, a cooking stove, a solar lantern, and some books. I had a good quality hunting knife, a hatchet, and a small first aid kit. I brought a GPS and a laminated paper map in case I lost signal, though I wasn't planning on going far off the grid. The spot I'd picked wasn't in a national park, but just bushland at the edge of a large cattle property. I'd camped in that general area before, about 4 years earlier with some old mates, but this time I was heading about 5 or 6 kilometers deeper, near a bend in the river that had a flat, grassy spot and some big gum trees for shade. The drive out was uneventful. The dirt track leading to the river was rough, full of potholes and washed out spots, but manageable if you took it slow. I arrived in the early afternoon, set up my tent under one of the larger trees, and walked a bit around the area. The river wasn't deep, maybe knee-high in most spots, and clear enough that you could see smooth stones at the bottom. I saw kangaroo tracks and droppings around, a few kookaburras perched on branches above, and the usual flies buzzing around my head. Typical bush. That first night was peaceful. I made a fire, cooked some beans and sausages on the small pan, and read until it got dark. I didn't hear anything unusual, just frogs, insects, and the occasional cracking of branches in the distance, probably wallabies or possums. The sky was clear, and the stars were so bright it felt like you could touch them. The second day, I explored further up the river. I took a small backpack with some food, water, and my knife. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just walking, clearing my head, enjoying the feeling of being completely alone. I followed a path that hugged the river for maybe an hour and saw no signs of anyone else being around. No boot prints, no tire marks, no wrappers or rubbish. It was like no one had been there in years. I found a small rocky outcrop overlooking a deep part of the river and sat there for a while, just listening to the wind and the birds. I stayed up there for maybe 2 hours before heading back to camp. When I got back, everything was as I'd left it. At least I thought so at first. It wasn't until after dinner, when I was tossing scraps away from the campsite, that I noticed something odd. My folding chair had been moved slightly. Not much, just a couple of feet to the side, but I was sure I'd left it next to the tent, facing the fire pit. Now it was angled away toward the trees. I thought maybe I'd kicked it without noticing, or a strong gust of wind had shifted it. I even checked for animal tracks, thinking maybe a roo had bumped it, but the ground was undisturbed. I shrugged it off. I didn't want to start imagining things. After all, I'd come here to get away from overthinking. That night, I woke up just after midnight. I had to piss. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold night air. The moon was bright, casting shadows between the trees. As I moved away from the tent, I felt something strange, a kind of tension in the air. The bush was quiet, too quiet. No frogs, no bugs, not even wind in the leaves. I froze, just listening. Then I saw it. A figure standing near the tree line, about 20 meters from my tent. Not moving, just standing there. I could see the shape of a person, a man, judging by the broad shoulders and the way he was standing, but no details. He wasn't holding a torch. He wasn't moving at all. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. My eyes played tricks in the dark sometimes, especially when I was half asleep. But then the figure shifted slightly, just a small movement, like he turned his head. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, unsure what to do. I didn't want to run and make noise, but I wasn't about to go back to sleep either. I slowly backed toward the tent, keeping my eyes on the shape, and grabbed my flashlight from inside. When I shined it toward the trees, the figure was gone. Just trees and shadows. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I looked for footprints, but the ground was too dry and covered in leaves to show anything clear. I told myself it had probably been a tree stump, or maybe I'd been half dreaming, but I didn't really believe that. I should have packed up and left, but something in me didn't want to give up. I told myself I was overreacting. I'd come out here for peace and quiet, and I wasn't about to let a bad night ruin that. The third day was tense. I kept checking over my shoulder whenever I walked anywhere. I kept the knife on me even while eating or sitting by the fire. I didn't go far from camp. I tried reading, but I couldn't concentrate. Everything seemed off. Birds would fly off suddenly, the wind sounded wrong, and there was this constant feeling of being watched. Around dusk, I saw something again. Just a flash of movement through the trees. Not an animal, it moved like a person, fast but deliberate. Too far to see clearly. I stood still for a long time, straining to hear anything, but it was silent. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up by the fire, staring into the dark. At one point, I heard a twig snap close by, maybe 10 meters from the edge of the firelight. I spun around with my flashlight, but again, nothing. The beam caught trees, rocks, and undergrowth. Nothing else. At some point near sunrise, I must have dozed off in the chair because I woke up stiff and cold, with the fire burned down to glowing coals. I decided I'd had enough. I packed up camp as fast as I could and loaded everything into the Hilux. Before I left, I walked around the area one last time, just to check. That's when I found it. A single boot print in the mud near the river. Not mine. Bigger, heavier. It was fresh. I got in the Uda and started the engine. As I pulled back onto the rough dirt track, I looked once more into the trees, and I saw him, standing by one of the trees, half hidden in shadow, tall, wearing what looked like a dirty, long-sleeved shirt and a wide-brim hat. He wasn't trying to hide, just standing there watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't take my eyes off the road after that. It took me over an hour to get back to the main road, and another 2 to get back to town. When I reached Warrawong, I drove straight to a servo, parked in the sun, and just sat there for a while. I kept looking at the people around me, couples, trot-eyes, mums with kids, trying to ground myself. It felt like I'd come back from another world. I told a mate what had happened a few days later. He said he wasn't surprised. That part of the bush had a weird reputation. There were stories, people seeing someone out there. A man who didn't talk, didn't approach, just watched. No crimes linked to it, no reports, but enough weird encounters that locals didn't camp out that way anymore. I never went back. I still love the bush, but I don't camp alone anymore. Not way out, at least. I keep to known parks, marked sites, and where I can see or hear other campers nearby. It's not about being scared, it's about being smart. That man, whoever he was, wasn't just passing through. He knew that area. He'd been watching me since I got there, probably longer. He never came close, never spoke, never threatened me. But that's what made it worse. He didn't have to. His silence, his stillness, it said enough. And I'll never forget the way he looked that last morning. like he was disappointed I left, like he wanted me to stay longer, but I'm glad I didn't. It was the summer of 2023 when I decided to head out on my own for a camping trip in the heart of the Scottish countryside. I had always been drawn to the vast, quiet expanses of rural landscapes, away from the noise and rush of city life. The plan was simple: take a week off work, hike into the hills, set up camp, and unwind. No distractions, just me, the wilderness, and a few essentials. Little did I know, the trip would become a memory I would never forget. The morning I left, the sky was a perfect shade of blue, with just a few wisps of cloud hanging in the sky. I had everything packed: my tent, sleeping bag, stove, a few days' worth of food, and the few other things that seemed necessary for survival in the wild. I drove my old van to the small village where I planned to start the hike. There was an old path up into the hills, a route not often used anymore. It had once been a route for shepherds, but now it seemed forgotten, hidden among the thick woods and the steep slopes. After parking the van, I shouldered my pack, tightened the straps, and began my hike. The path started off easy enough, winding through dense forest, with the occasional break in the trees offering sweeping views of the valley below. The chirping of birds was the only sound, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me as I walked. The first few hours passed without issue. I stopped to rest occasionally, taking in the beauty of the place. The air was fresh, clean, and cool, and the deeper I went into the hills, the quieter it became. Eventually, the path became steeper, and the woods seemed to close in around me, as though they were guarding the land from the outside world. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing, and I decided it was the perfect place to set up camp. I quickly set up my tent and built a small fire to cook some dinner. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, and the coolness of evening was starting to creep in. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and I sat back, staring into the flames, letting the warmth wash over me. Everything felt right, peaceful. As the night settled in, the woods around me seemed to grow quieter. No more birds, no wind, just the occasional rustle of leaves from some unseen animal. I didn't think much of it. It was normal for the countryside to be quiet at night, I told myself. The fire slowly burned down to embers, and I crawled into my sleeping bag, letting the stillness of the night wrap around me. It wasn't long before I heard it. A noise, faint at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone or something was walking nearby. It wasn't the soft, shuffling steps of a forest animal. These were deliberate, heavy, human-like footsteps, slow but steady. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It could have been another camper, though I hadn't seen anyone since I left the village. But the idea of another person so far off the beaten path felt odd. I lay there, motionless, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps came closer. Then suddenly they stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, else to break the silence. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the forest around me. My mind raced. Maybe it was just a deer or a stray dog, I told myself. Yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A few minutes passed before the sound resumed, this time closer than before. The steps were heavier now, more deliberate. I could almost feel them through the ground, vibrating faintly beneath me. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively grabbed the knife I kept by my side. It was a silly thought, I knew. I was miles from any road, far from any help, but the anxiety was overwhelming. I stayed completely still, my eyes wide open in the dark, watching the outline of my tent against the blackness outside. I couldn't see anything. It was as if the footsteps had been swallowed by the forest. But I could hear them, getting nearer with each passing second. It was then that I realized something was very wrong. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't moving like a normal person. The steps, though heavy, were irregular. They didn't follow the typical rhythm of walking. There was a shuffling sound mixed in with the footsteps, like someone dragging their feet. And then the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the ground, nails or metal, maybe, I couldn't tell. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Panic started to rise. I considered packing up and leaving right then. But I wasn't sure where I'd go in the dark or what I might run into if I left the safety of my tent. Staying put felt safer, though I wasn't sure for how long. The footsteps continued, now circling my campsite. I could feel the weight of whatever it was, pacing in a way that didn't make sense. I heard it then, a sharp snap of a branch, followed by a low, guttural sound, like a breath being held too long. My heart skipped a beat. Whatever it was close, too close. I was about to grab my pack and leave when I heard the sound of a twig snapping loudly from behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The thing, I still couldn't tell what it was standing behind me. I dared not move. I could feel its presence, like a shadow looming over me, too close. I barely dared to breathe, afraid that any movement would give me away. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps faded. Slowly, almost deliberately, they retreated back into the forest, as though the thing had gotten bored or decided to leave. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I even dared to shift. My body was tense, my muscles sore from holding still so long. Finally, I let out a shaky breath, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. My instincts told me that whatever had been out there wasn't something I wanted to face again. I packed up my tent as quickly as I could, grabbing only the essentials. I didn't look back. I didn't even care about leaving the campsite in a mess. I hurried down the trail, my mind racing, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness. Every sound made me jump. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like it could be the thing following me again. The further I walked, the more the fear subsided, but it never fully went away. I finally reached the van in the early hours of the morning. My legs were trembling, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys to start the engine. Once I was inside, I locked the doors and didn't stop until I was miles away from the campsite. The rest of the trip, it didn't happen. I drove straight home, unsettled and unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me in those woods. It had felt real, the danger palpable, but it was gone now, and I would never return to those hills. Something out there was too wild, too unpredictable. For me, I wasn't going to risk it again. As I sat back in my living room, still rattled, I remembered one thing that kept circling my thoughts. There was no sound, no movement, when the footsteps first stopped. It was as if whatever it was had been waiting for me to react, to make a sound, to give itself away. But I never did, and maybe that's what saved me.